Good evening, everybody. I'm Doris Wise Montrose, President of Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors, and I welcome you here tonight. We are grateful to the Lux Hotel for continuing to graciously provide us with such a beautiful venue for our important events. I just have to say that I am dumbfounded at the world's continued unrelenting focus on the State of Israel, and by the State of Israel, I mean the Jewish people. A country the size of New Jersey with a population of just over 7 million, while there are real humanitarian crises all over the world, with real people really being slaughtered, abused, and starved daily by real tyrants and dictators, many of whom occupy seats in the United Nations. So I understand their desire to turn the attention away from themselves. What I would like to understand is the compliance of the Western free world in this utterly horrific and willful neglect. I do, however, recognize the behavior. It's what they did during the Holocaust. Tonight we are here between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur with a brilliant group of panelists to discuss where Israel finds herself now and in the future following the events of September at the United Nations. I'm sure that you are familiar with their work and have heard them speak at our events in the past. I am grateful to each and every one of them for agreeing to participate and for the time and effort I know that they put into their presentations. Omri Saren blogs for Commentary Magazine's Contentions blog and his own blog, Mere Rhetoric. His articles and posts have appeared in the Jerusalem Post, the LA Jewish Journal, the Pittsburgh Jewish Journal, and Commentary Magazine. And his investigative journalism has been cited by the Associated Press, Reuters, the New York Times, CNN, and the BBC. Omri will discuss Beyond Assurances, the U.S.-Israel alliance after Obama, U.S. diplomacy after the Arab Spring. Rick Richmond edits Jewish Current Issues. His articles and posts have appeared in American Thinker, Commentary Magazine, Contentions, the Jewish Journal, the Jewish Press, the New York Sun, and Pajamas Media. Rick will discuss Beyond the Two-State Non-Solution, One State, Three States, or No State. Jennifer J.E. Dyer is a retired naval officer living in the Inland Empire. She has written for Hot Air, Commentary, The Weekly Standard, and her own blog, The Optimistic Conservative. She is writing a book on the Reagan strategy in the Cold War. Jennifer will discuss Beyond the Pax Americana, Israeli security issues in a less secure world. Avi Bell, who will be with us tonight via Skype, say hello, holds multiple degrees from Harvard and the University of Chicago, clerked for the Supreme Court of Israel, and has taught courses on the laws of war and the legal aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict. He is a professor at Bar Ilan University, Faculty of Law, as well as the University of San Diego Law School. Avi will discuss Beyond the UN, the shape of lawfare to come. A question and answer session will follow the presentations, so that as many questions as possible can be answered. We have 3x5 cards on which you can write your question. If you didn't take a card when you came in and you would like to ask a question, just raise your hand and we'll come give you one, or we'll pick it up. Please indicate if your question is directed to the group or to a specific panelist. At this time, kindly turn off your cell phones and other electronic devices, and I will now turn the presentation over to Omri Saren.
So I'd like to add my thanks to Doris's, to all of you for coming out here tonight, also to Rick, Jennifer, and Avi, and also to you guys, and to the Lux, to CJHS for putting on these kinds of events. I drew the short straw, so I have the broad overview part of our evening, where what I want to talk about is kind of a framework for thinking about the specific regional, military, and diplomatic problems and controversies that the rest of the speakers will be talking about. So we've got a new geopolitical situation, we've got a new diplomatic situation, we've got a new international situation at the UN, And the question is, what are the assumptions that the U.S. is going to have going into those, so that when we examine them in their specifics, we can kind of get a sense for the direction they'll go? And how will Israel react to that? Because, of course, it's no secret that the United States, as Israel's great protector in international forums, supplies them with a lot of their crucial military arms. If the relationship between the U.S. and Israel is changing, as it has been over the last 2 years, then the Israelis also have to begin recalculating how they're going to behave. So that's the general approach that I want to take. The overarching theme that I want to discuss, if I have one, is that the Arab Spring has left the Obama administration's diplomatic plan for the Middle East, which is to say the United States' plan, completely in shambles. The Obama administration came into office with a number of goals that are grounded in a number of assumptions. We were going to use Egypt in order to create a rapprochement between the West and the Muslim world. There was the Cairo speech. They were going to serve as a moderate bulwark in the region. And in order to advance that, we did things like cut pro-democracy funding so that the Mubarak government wouldn't get upset. Technically what we did is we conditioned aid to non-governmental organizations in Egypt on the approval of the Mubarak government, essentially zeroing out pro-democracy aid. We were going to engage Iran. There was going to be a grand bargain that was going to solve our problems in Afghanistan and Iraq. We did that under the assumption that they had enough popular support, enough legitimacy that the government would be long-term, and B, that it would be stable. Obviously, the election crisis overturned that, and more so, the regime's response to the election crisis prevented Western leaders from being able to credibly explain to their populations why they were willing to try to strike a modus vivendi with these kinds of totalitarian thugs. Syria was going to be a prize for the Obama administration. It was supposed to be low-hanging fruit. The Obama administration, before it took power, was convinced that the Syrians could be peeled away, was usually the phrase used, from Iran. And they were convinced that because people who were advising then Senator Obama told him so. And we'll get a little bit into that kind of dynamic about why the president believes the things that he does and whether or not he's been mugged by reality on those issues. But we were going to peel Syria away from Iran. Everyone in this room knows that thousands and thousands of bodies later, nobody still entertains the possibility that Assad is a reformer. Turkey was going to serve as a bridge between the East and the West. Libya was going to reemerge as an energy supplier that could be relied upon. The Gulf states were going to help us get at al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula. All of these assumptions have been overturned because these states turned out not to be as stable as we thought they were and not to be as moderate as we were told they were. And then, with Iran on one side of the Middle East, there was, of course, the Israeli-Palestinian peace process that the president was going to supercharge by instilling in the Palestinians specifically confidence that the Israelis could make a deal. The president came in, he said, the problem is that the Palestinians don't believe Israeli intentions are sincere, and more problematically, they don't have any faith that we can bring the Israelis to the table. We'll disprove them. And as of last week, Abbas has gone out of his way to embarrass the President of the United Nations, specifically wording the Palestinian Unilateral Declaration of Independence in a way that mimics things that the President was saying in 2009-2010. He did it over the administration's objections, and by all accounts, the President is not fooled. He knows what Abbas was aiming for, and he's livid with him. So we've had a complete collapse across the Middle East, country by country and globally. And why did we have that collapse? We had it for a very simple reason. There's no tricks here. We had it because the administration believed things that weren't true about the Middle East. There's this famous Ronald Reagan line about how it's not that liberals or the left or Democrats don't know things. It's not they're ignorant. It's just that so much of what they believe is wrong. That's exactly what happened in the Middle East. And we had two overarching theories. about how the Middle East worked that were embraced by President Obama and by the people around President Obama even more so. One goes under the banner, the trappings of linkage. The idea that in the Middle East, the problems in Arab and Muslim countries are symptoms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict rather than causes. So certainly, me and my fellow panelists, certainly I would imagine most of the people in this room think that one of the reasons that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has proven intractable is because Arab states that don't have an incentive to make peace with Israel continue to keep the Palestinians disenfranchised, non-citizens, etc., in order to keep them as a thorn in Israel's side. That's one theory. The other theory is no, what happens is that the Arab world is dysfunctional because totalitarian leaders cause their populations to obsess over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and you won't make any progress, political, diplomatic, military, or otherwise, until you resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This was the theory of linkage that was propagated, at least, formally propagated, at least since the Carter administration. We know the fate of that theory. We've seen that it turns out the Arab street was not so obsessed that they couldn't look past the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in order to change their own domestic political situation. So linkage was one of the theories that the Obama administration came in with. And this, by the way, is not anything that people... This is a disagreement. This is not ideological. This is not a conspiracy theory about the Obama administration. This is a foreign policy debate. There are people on one side, there are people on the other. The point I want to emphasize to you, and I'll emphasize this again and again, is that these are no longer open questions. These are no longer arguments on one side and arguments on the other. These are closed questions. Is the Arab world and do Arab populations obsess over Israel to such a degree that they are unable to change their domestic political situation? Is the theory of linkage right? No. That's a closed question. The Arab Spring happened. The second dogma that the Obama administration carried in with it to office is this "if only Israel would" idea. And that's the idea that but for realistic, moderate, reasonable Israeli concessions, the Palestinians would be willing to negotiate. That if only Israel would give a little more, the Palestinians would be willing to negotiate. How did this, and this was a theory, there were arguments on both sides. There were arguments that said, listen to these Palestinian leaders that say they'd be willing to negotiate if Israel did a settlement freeze, a temporary settlement freeze, versus skeptics who said, listen to these Arab leaders, they are not committed to creating a state, they're committed to destroying Israel. The Obama administration went all in. They said, you know what, let's do some confidence building measures, settlement freezes, 1967 lines, etc. How did this question get resolved? Well, the skeptics were right. The Palestinians took the confidence building measures and made them preconditions to future negotiations. This is no longer an open question. The question of will the Palestinians be brought to the table by the specific confidence building measures is no longer an open question. It's not a matter of arguments on one side or the other. Reality has determined for us which of these hypotheses are true. And in fact, a source no less, should I say, credible than Abbas himself said that Obama led him up a tree on the settlement freeze and then abandoned him there. It's not an open question. So those are two debates that ought to have been settled, and I'll discuss in a bit why they haven't been. But the third settled question that I want to emphasize is settled now, at least ought to be settled, is the question, the debate over whether or not, the degree to which the U.S. has reliable allies in the Middle East. For decades, those people who supported a robust Israeli-American alliance said that Israel is the only reliable, stable ally in the Middle East. And then on the other side, the realists said, I'm painting with a broad brushstroke, but the realists said, no, there are plenty of autocratic regimes, and in fact, we could have better relations with the Egypts and the Syrias and the Lebanons and the Jordans of the world if only we were willing to sell out Israel. Or whatever euphemism we were using that week, a balanced actor, etc., etc. And the response from those who support a robust U.S.-Israeli alliance is those countries aren't sustainable. This is a question that's been settled. Is there a U.S. ally today in the Middle East that can be relied upon to share U.S. norms and promote U.S. interests other than Israel? There is not. This isn't a question of that you can slice. This isn't a question that's amenable to nuance. Israel is, as was said by a Democratic congressperson a couple days ago, Israel is the U.S.'s land-based aircraft carrier in the Middle East. It's how we project our power. It's if we need to move assets, if we need intelligence sharing. We can't rely on Egypt. We certainly can't rely on Syria or Lebanon. Turkey is doing as much to undermine NATO, which is how we exert power in that part of the world, as they are to promote NATO. They're actually doing much more. This debate is settled. So why isn't the conversation that we're having, the debate's been settled, the options are clear, and just to tip my hand, and I think tip the hand of most of the panelists, my simplistic version, you'll hear nuanced versions about this in the context of the Eastern Mediterranean, in the context of diplomacy, and in the context of legal forms, but my unnuanced reading is the U.S. has to buckle down, decide who its allies are, and decide who its enemies are, and act accordingly. And the punchline here is that you don't take a balanced approach as a country, as a person, as a civilization, between your enemies and your allies. There is nothing that's positive about wanting to be balanced between people who are undermining your interest and people who are promoting your interest. So why isn't that it? And the reason is because, and we should be fairly precise about this, there are people who advocate Middle East policies today. Many of them are very close to the president. All of them are open in what their beliefs are, who pretend that these are open questions, who continue to act as if the Palestinians are amenable to confidence-building measures, who continue to act. There was an editorial in this morning's LA Times about engagement with Iran, who continue to believe, less so this week, but who continue to advocate that Assad is amenable to engagement. And so we have this problem, and you hear this more, apologies in advance, you hear this more when Paul Krugman gets frustrated, where he talks about, out of sheer frustration, where he talks about zombie theories. Theories that have been flat disproven. Theories that had arguments on one side and arguments on the other, and reality said, this side is right, this side is wrong, that people continue to pretend are open questions. And so we have this morning a State Department statement saying that, congratulating Israel and the Palestinians on having both accepted the quartet guidelines for renewed negotiations. The interesting thing about that is that the Palestinians, instead of accepting the guidelines, explicitly rejected them. The Palestinians looked at the quartet statement, they said this calls for negotiations without preconditions, here are a couple of preconditions. The State Department interpretation was exactly the opposite. Now, before we go too far afield, the State Department has as much or more of an interest as anybody else in pretending out loud that the Palestinians are still amenable to a peace deal. It's like if it makes the Palestinians look worse if they stay away from the table after they've been welcomed. This could be brilliant statecraft. My worry is that it's not. My worry is that the theories about the potential to create a modus vivendi with Middle East autocracies, Middle East totalitarian systems, and Middle East Islamist systems are still alive, that theories about how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict creates tensions across the region rather than the other way around are still alive, the idea that the Palestinians can be brought to the table are still alive. And if that's the case, then we're facing a different post-September situation than the one that I would advocate, which is exert American power unapologetically. The President's speech at the UN was as robust a validation and robust a statement about the importance of the U.S.-Israeli alliance and Israeli rights as you could expect from a U.S. President under the constraints that he has. Maybe there has been a shift in the Oval Office. The flip side of that is that, and it does represent at least a rhetorical shift. For 2 years, this president and this administration said, and I'm quoting now, don't look at what we do, don't look at what we say, look at what we do. In other words, don't look at how we're publicly trashing Israel, look at the fact that there are stories that we're giving them weapons. That was deeply, deeply dishonest, both about the extent to which there were security relations that were begun under the Obama administration, but also because it's just a bad argument. It doesn't do Israel any good to have a bunch of weapons that they can't use because international forums have become hostile. The fact that that's no longer the argument, especially in an election season, is heartening. Maybe the president looked out, maybe the president reevaluated the last 3 years. And we've known, by the way, if you'll allow me a caveat, we've known that the president has been bumping into reality for a while. Very early in his administration, there was an incident on his tour where he was in Saudi Arabia that devolved into a screaming match between the king and between President Obama. And there are two versions of the stories. There are two versions of what happened in that room. One version is the president walked in and he said, basically, we know you're concerned about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We know that you can't do anything until it's resolved. We're going to get this done for you. And then we'll turn to Iran. And the king just lost it. And he's like, I don't know who your advisors are, but we're more concerned about Iran. You can't be so stupid that you listen to what we say in public about the Israelis and the Palestinians. What's going on? And he just lost it. The second version of the story is that the president walked in and he said, listen, I can bring the Israelis to the table, but you got to give me something back. Can you open a trade office with Israel? Can you allow the Israelis to open a trade office here? As a confidence-building measure, and the king flipped out and said, what would ever cause you to imagine we would accept Israelis on Saudi soil? Either way, we know what happened after President Obama got back is he recalled Dennis Ross to the White House so that he'd have someone around him who knew something about the Middle East. Because he had gone in, apparently, not knowing what was going on. So maybe he's changed. The theory that he hasn't changed is the one that I think everybody's afraid of. And that's the theory that the enthusiasm with which this president tried to detonate the U.S.-Israeli alliance in 2009 and 2010 comes from a place that is not reachable by argument. You have to remember that when Netanyahu came to D.C. the first time around under Obama, the administration was leaking, proudly leaking, how they were slapping him up and down Capitol Hill. There was a specific article that they leaked to a specific journalist and gave quotes about how Netanyahu was frustrated because he doesn't know what the president wants from him, because there's no longer a friendly face in D.C. And then in 2010, we all know what happened. It was in the aftermath of Biden's visit to Israel. Netanyahu didn't get a photo op, etc., etc. Where does that hostility come from? And here, I don't think we should get too conspiratorial. We should be as simplistic as possible, and that is everything that this president, and I'm talking about him as a human being now, I'm talking about him at dinners, I'm talking about him in hallways, I'm talking about him in seminars. Everything he knew about the Middle East, capital K knew, everything he knew about the Middle East came from people who were hostile to Israel. They were either romantically enamored with Palestinian resistance, the Rashid Khalidis of the world, or they were foreign policy analysts who for one reason or another had an incentive, institutional incentive, intellectual incentive, financial incentive, to toe the anti-Israel line. And we know, by the way, that the president does, this is not as read foreign policy blogs from the left before he goes to sleep occasionally. So that's definitely one of the streams. And the third was the left-wing Jewish community in Chicago that had an incentive to believe that what they believed should be done in the Middle East, i.e., Palestinian state, giving up settlements, etc., is what the Israelis wanted so that they could call themselves pro-Israel. And these were the people that then said, that lawyer, then senator, then President Obama talked to. And so if he is the analytical mind that, at least in some context, he does appear to be, then he would have figured out over the course of 3 years, something's not right here. The people who have been telling me things that I then act on keep colliding with reality. If that's true, and this is what I'll leave you with, then this is what is going to happen. You're going to see a walk back in a very precise way from what's happened in the last 2.5 years. And the flip side of this is an examination of the way that the Israeli-American alliance has been undermined in the last 2.5 years, and that is at the level of assurances. Ergo, the title of my talk. The land for peace bargain that goes back to Camp Sinai, to Camp David, to the Sinai Accords, is fundamentally asymmetrical. The Israelis give up tangibles, i.e. land, that are difficult to reverse, and in exchange they get assurances that are easy to reverse. How is this playing out in Egypt right now? Well, the Egyptians are about to abrogate the peace treaty. They're not meeting their normalization requirements. They're not meeting their energy requirements. Is Israel going to roll back into the Sinai and take back what they gave up in order to get their assurances? No. Tangibles for intangibles. Hard to reverse versus easy to reverse. How do you balance that out? You have the United States, and to a lesser extent other Western powers, provide security assurances and provide diplomatic assurances and say, if something goes wrong, we've got your back. You'll be allowed to defend yourself if this goes bad, and we'll protect you while you do it. Turning now to what happened after the disengagement from Gaza. The Israelis were given assurances, A, the Bush letters, diplomatic assurances, that their concession would not be wasted, and B, military assurances, that if an Iranian proxy took over and started attacking Israeli civilians, Israel would be allowed to retaliate. We know how that ended up. Israel attempted to protect its civilians. They got Goldstone and a supercharged boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. And Israel attempted to enforce the Bush letters, only to have the Obama administration declare that the Bush letters were no longer binding, despite having been passed by both houses of Congress overwhelmingly and affirmed by the White House. Now, if it turns out that the administration has internalized what's gone wrong, if they have figured out that the things they believed directly led them to expectations that collided with reality, one of the places you're going to see it, and it's going to be done quietly, but it's absolutely necessary, is at the level of assurances. You'll start seeing explicit discussions of how the United States will meet the obligations to its ally Israel that it has undertaken meeting. And if not, then it might be an electoral stunt, and we'll see how it plays out in the Israeli-Palestinian arena, but we'll also see how it plays out in the exertion of U.S. power in the Eastern Mediterranean and U.S. diplomacy. And on that note, I'll turn it over to Jennifer. You need your phone?
I don't. Nope, I just wrote a note to help me think. Good evening. Can you hear me? Okay, very good. Okay, first slide, please. Good evening. Well, what I'm here to talk about is the changing world situation, and I'm not sure that people in general grasp how very much the situation has already changed. What we have here is kind of an abstract depiction of the world that we used to live in about 3 years ago. And it was a very simple world. There was a lot of water. There were very few prominent players. You didn't necessarily have to differentiate Asia a whole lot because Asia was hemmed about by the United States. We had naval power. We had NATO on the other end of Asia. We have an ally in Japan. And it was a very, it didn't seem so at the time, but a much more stable world than the one we're entering. Next slide, please. With the withdrawal, recession of U.S. power, and there's a lot of it still out there, we're just not using it. The Arab Spring is an excellent case in point where we could have gone in and tried to influence things much more than we did. We have a lot of power, both diplomacy and military, and we just didn't use it. And what we're seeing is primarily in the Eastern Hemisphere, it's turning into what it always used to be before the Pax Americana was imposed after World War II, and that is a giant landmass interrupted by a few slices of water running through it. And we are basically an island nation. We're a maritime power, and we don't think the way land powers do. But most of them have a whole lot of long borders with each other, a whole lot of other countries on the same continent to worry about. And what they end up doing is having a lot of regional disputes. They develop regional hegemons. There's just a whole lot of jockeying and back and forthing and alliances shifting and all kinds of things like that that we have not really had to worry about in the lifetimes of most of the people who are here. This is what the future is going to look like, however. And I would like to think, it would be really optimistic and nice to think that if we can elect someone else who takes office on January 2013, that things would go back to the way they were, but they're not going to. Too much has already been lost. So we're going to have to find a new stable level when we get the next president in office, whenever that is. Next, please. Yeah, and just leave it there. In this gigantic landmass with a little bit of water running through it, we have Russia, China, and they're fixated on a lot of things. But one of the things that's particularly important to them, and we have to get into territory now because we're not in that abstract world of U.S. power anymore. What I call the Great Crossroads is an area that trade has to go through, and if you don't have influence there, you're cut off from the other half of the continent. So everyone's worried about that. Russia's concerned, China's concerned. Just about everything they do between themselves and the Great Crossroads is designed to exert influence over the Great Crossroads. Turkey is a big player in that, becoming bigger. Iran is another player in it. Egypt is probably about to become a player in it since they are changing their government. And next slide, please. Of course, right at the middle of the Great Crossroads is Israel. This is absolutely wonderful. Google Earth did this for me. On the first map, it was a wonderful, peaceful world. The United States in big letters, Israel in big letters, and a bunch of other people. This depiction is much more indicative of what Israel is in the middle of now. The United States, the flag of the U.S., is not the biggest thing in Israel's world anymore. And I'm afraid that change has already occurred. So, Israel's got some shifting and changing to do. Now, what I'm looking at tonight is if you're Israel, what does the world look like to you now? Obviously, I could talk about the U.S. I'm not sure how much utility there is in that until we get a different administration. I don't know, even if this administration learns from the last few years, how much time there is left for it to make a difference between now and January of 2013. But next, please. But stay on this slide. Basically, Israel is now surrounded by a lot of jockeying powers, and without the U.S. Holding things in place for them, something like a Palestinian state, it's very important to understand that this is a terrible time to create a Palestinian state because all of the assurances about stability in the region are gone. They're not there anymore. NATO has had a terrible time in Libya, has done nothing about Syria. Egypt is in turmoil. It really is not clear what the future of NATO is, and that's the biggest security issue for this region. But Turkey, of course, is re-emerging with their neo-Ottoman ideas. Iran, obviously, getting the bomb over on the other side. There's just a whole lot of stuff going on, and you cannot give the assurances. There are no reliable assurances about the security situation in which you would develop a new Palestinian state. So the timing for that is simply terrible. My opinion is that even people in Europe, the leaders in Europe, see that, but we'll talk in a minute about what they're doing about it. Next, please. There are basically three dimensions I want to talk about in which this post-Pax Americana world is affecting Israel tonight. One of them is diplomacy. Next. And I want to talk just briefly about Nicolas Sarkozy in the UN. Many of you, I'm sure, know that he came charging in and said we need to admit the Palestinians as a non-member state and get them on a path to statehood. Well, why did he do that? I don't think it's because he has suddenly lost his mind. I think it's because he sees that there's a shift in the power structure and he wants to position France. He's not thinking so much about the Palestinians or about Israel as he is about France. France is a participant in the quartet through the European Union. But if the path to statehood for the Palestinians is put under the auspices of the UN, France has a role in it from the Security Council as France. She doesn't have to worry about what anyone else in the European Union thinks about it. She can act as France on the Security Council. It's a much more powerful role for France if she can arrange for things to be done that way. And Sarkozy is a very traditional European statesman. I guarantee you that that is the kind of thing he was thinking about. We haven't had our minds around that kind of thinking for a very long time, probably almost 100 years now. But this is what we're going to see Europe revert to, and that's the kind of thing that Israel will be having to deal with. Instead of quartet, with the U.S. as obviously the premier power in the quartet. I don't think there's any real question about that. That was very Pax Americana, American superpower, post-Cold War. This, with Sarkozy thinking, yeah, France will have more power if we act as France on the Security Council, that is the kind of world that we're moving into. Next. Another thing that's going to change is who will find Israel useful. And Russia is one of those nations that is has an idea of Israel as being very useful. Israel is a good counterweight to Islamism in its various forms. If Israel can establish a modus vivendi in the Middle East, that strikes a big blow for a problem that is very close to Russia's underbelly, because obviously they have to worry about Islamist insurgents on their own territory, and they're also worried about the rise of Turkey with a very definite model of state Islamism and the idea of a neo-Ottoman caliphate. So you're seeing Israel and Russia making common cause a lot more than they ever have in the past. Next, please. Israel reaching further afield to places like Africa, where an Israeli embassy was reopened in Ghana, for example, just this month. And in the middle of September, I don't think very many people realized it. This might have seemed a little odd, but Avigdor Lieberman was traveling Africa in the middle of September. He was visiting Ghana, Nigeria, Uganda, Ethiopia. I believe he went to six or seven countries. That might seem a little odd, but we'll see in a minute that Africa is in a world where territory matters, and influence between nations about territory and whether they have waterway rights and things like that. Israel needs to reach out very much in a geographic manner, and Africa is one of those places. Next, please. And this is Shimon Peres in Azerbaijan. Central Asia is another place where Israel is reaching out. You may not know that Israel has a strong push, not only with Azerbaijan, but in Turkmenistan and Tajikistan. And, flanking Iran is obviously of importance here. Flanking Turkey is another issue. Israel is basically, under Netanyahu, has behaved very much as the model of a nation state in the 19th and early 20th century mold. Next, please. The next dimension in which this post-Pax Americana world affects Israel is regional power relationships, military threats, things of that nature that are starting to reemerge. America kept a lot of things in check simply by being a global superpower that are now no longer being held quite so much in check. The reason I'm showing you this, it's over at the other end of Asia, and it's in the South China Sea. This is something that the people in that area, Southeast Asia, very much fear China is trying to do, and that is take anti-ship cruise missiles and plant them on all the little islands throughout the South China Sea. And you can see that if they were able to do that, they could blanket the area with cruise missiles. And those threat rings, and basically, you can't get through them as a commercial ship and not be held at risk. And that's something that it's feared China wants to do. Certainly her diplomatic actions suggest she would like to do something like that, and she would have the capability to do. Next slide, please. And that is not at all something that could not happen in the Mediterranean and right off Israel's shores. This is something that I wrote about months ago, basically as the Arab Spring was just breaking out and we weren't sure if anything was going to happen in Syria. The Russians have been promising to Syria for a long time their state-of-the-art anti-ship cruise missile, the P-800 Yakhont. And this is, if you look at those rings, the blue ring is if it were deployed in Lebanon, and the red ring is if it were deployed in Syria. How far down that missile could reach and influence shipping. It could also be targeted at things on land. But the bottom line is, from the coast of the Mediterranean, you can hold a lot of shipping at risk. Well, that may not happen. We don't know what's going to happen in Syria, but things like that could happen. From northern Cyprus, for example, the Turks could put anti-ship cruise missiles on land there that could hold shipping at risk all the way down to the Suez Canal, all along the coast of Israel. That kind of thing is definitely a concern, and it's only going to get worse. Next, please. But stay on this slide now. Thank you. Of course, a lot of people are aware about the drilling that's going on off Cyprus right now. And one of the key issues with that is that Turkey is using it as a pretext for elevating the level of her naval profile. She's changing her naval posture and now intends to have ships that Turkey never used to patrol the Mediterranean, at least not since she was the Ottoman Empire. And now she does. Now she's planning to. She has ships out there right now escorting a seismic exploration ship that she put out there solely because Cyprus contracted with Noble Energy to put a drilling rig off southern Cyprus. The Turkish ship is out there right next to where the Noble Energy rig is drilling and has a naval escort with it. The Turks have stated that they intend to keep their ships on patrol in the eastern Mediterranean. That's something new and different. That's not something that they've been doing. And what that allows them to do is spin up against Israel, for example, on a much shorter timeline. Instead of having to get a ship underway, they'll have a ship on station. And Turkey ships have anti-air missiles, they have naval guns, they have all the normal things. They have cruise missiles, they have the XSA cruise missile, all the things that you find on a modern warship. Another thing that this does is it brings escalatory rumors out. And we're starting to see that, for example, with the rumor that Israeli Air Force planes are going to patrol Cypriot Air Force on airspace on behalf of Cyprus. Well, I don't think that's true, but it's a rumor that is out there. Does Avi need a response? If he's dropped out, I want to make sure we have him back. Okay, he's there. All right. And another thing another rumor that came out this weekend was that Israeli F-15s went out and buzzed the Turkish ship. that is out there doing the seismic exploration. I don't believe that that is true either. That would be very unprofessional activity on the part of the IAF, and I don't think they did that. But rumors like that are going to abound. And the situations where there are more patrols, more naval ships out, more aircraft out, basically it's an escalation, and there's no control in sight. We don't know what NATO is going to do. In theory, NATO would step in to ensure that this doesn't flame up. Cyprus is not in NATO, but Greece is, and so is Turkey. So in theory, NATO would put the kibosh on this thing escalating, but we're not seeing anything from NATO. We're not seeing positive diplomacy, positive expressions of strength from NATO on this. So very, very problematic. Next slide, please. Obviously, you all, I don't need to recount for you Lebanon and Syria and Egypt, and those things have all changed. Israel's security situation has already changed. It's different. It's not what it was a year ago. One of the things Omri mentioned that is quite true, the troop deployments into the Sinai. Now, so far, Egypt has spoken with Israel and gotten Israel's agreement to do those troop deployments, but they're growing. They haven't stated how many troops they have there. My estimate, based on the latest thing, the latest addition that they negotiated at the end of August, is probably between 5,000 and 6,000. And they did deploy tanks with the increased troops that they put into the Sinai at the end of August. Egypt is not ever going to withdraw those troops. That's not going to happen. You could be the friendliest Egyptian government in the world, and the advantage to you of having the troops in the Sinai is so great that you're never going to give that advantage away. You might have it negotiated away from you if you can get big enough concessions of some kind, but they are never going to unilaterally withdraw those troops. So a huge issue for Israeli security now is that there are troops in the Sinai. Presumably they would know if more of them go in, but they're starting to lose that indications and warning bubble on what kind of forces are in the Sinai and how much warning time they would have if an attack were to be mounted on them. They haven't been in that situation, obviously, since the 1979 peace agreement was signed. Next. But stay on the same slide, please. Thank you. The Red Sea was a sleepy hollow for quite a while. It has been almost 3 decades since the last time we really had to worry about it, when Gaddafi was suspected of mining the Red Sea. That was in 1984, I think. It's no longer a sleepy hollow. 3 years ago, there was nothing going on there. Now, the Iranians have used the anti-piracy operations. They've exploited that to start naval patrols in the Red Sea. And in June of this year, they announced that they had put a submarine in the Red Sea. And they're capable of doing that. I believe that they did, and that the reason they announced it was so that if someone detected their submarine, one of the NATO ships that was in there, that they would understand that an Iranian submarine was there and not try to attack it. Obviously, that's a concern for Israel. It's a concern for everyone in the area, but certainly for Israel. Next slide, please. And the final thing, we've talked about 2 things now: diplomacy and regional developments, threats emerging, and so forth. With the end of the Pax Americana, the final thing I'll just look at is the problem of Iran. 3 years ago, Israel could have flown through Turkey or Saudi Arabia to get to Iran if they needed to attack Iranian facilities there. And there were fewer facilities to attack. Does someone need to answer that? Today, that's no longer the case. Obviously, Israel can't go through Turkey, may or may not be able to go through Saudi Arabia. That's a possibility. But Israel is having to expand their idea of how to attack these facilities in Iran. There are more of them now. It couldn't possibly be done in 3 or 4 days' worth of air attacks. There have to be different approaches. One of the possibilities is using submarines, of course, but they're never going to get another submarine through the Suez Canal again, at least not as things currently stand. So their submarines would have to go around Africa if they were to do it in order to maintain stealth. And this is where some of the diplomacy comes in, because the kind of submarines they have require refueling and replenishment. Where are they going to do that? They have to do it in Africa somewhere. Well, Ghana and Nigeria both have coastlines, and Ethiopia has a little strip of coastline. So when Israel is out trolling for new friends in Africa, that's one of the things they're thinking about, is how do I get a submarine around Africa if I need to attack Iran. Another option, of course, we talked about making friends with Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and so forth. Well, where are those? They're right north of Iran. If you wanted to sneak special forces into Iran from the north, that would be one way to do it. And if you open up trade with those countries, then you can start flying things into the country that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get into them. So Israel is having to think about all these things in a different way. At some point, it's not really even possible to say who is going to help Israel take down Iran if that becomes necessary. One of the issues, though, with the passage of the years and the unfortunate diplomacy of our current administration, is that the U.S. ability to contain the consequences if Israel attacks Iran, or if we do, has declined considerably. With the problems in Bahrain, we're not going to be able to launch military operations from Bahrain. We've already had Kuwait and Qatar both tell us that we can't do that. And we're not going to get help from Turkey. We're not going to get it from Egypt. We may get some help from Jordan, but that's dicey. So we have really, our ability to do what we could have done 3 years ago in the case of an attack on Iran has been seriously eroded. That is something that Israel has to take into account in making their plans. So but the bottom line on this is that, Omri was talking about the U.S. Perhaps understanding a collision with reality in our dealings with Israel. And I think that they would be looking in the rearview mirror to understand that collision. We've already had so many changes now that we're already in the new reality. And the old formula with the quartet and the idea of a Palestinian state as the issue for world security, world stability, is out the window. That was an artifact of the very stable world that we had with the U.S. being a superpower that imposed conditions on everyone else. We are not doing that. We have not done it under Obama. To start doing it again would be jarring. People are going to start saying no to us if we try to do it. So the world has very much changed, and the issue of a Palestinian state has to be seen in that sense, that there are no reliable security assurances that can be given about how a state would affect either Israel or the rest of the region. And with that, I will turn it over to Rick.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you all for being here. Last month, the 18th anniversary of the famous handshake on the White House lawn passed virtually unnoticed. We are now in the 19th year of the current effort to create peace by creating a Palestinian state in land that was formally designated nearly 100 years ago as the national homeland of the Jews, in an area where the only independent states that have ever existed have been Jewish ones. We are now in the third year of an effort to create a Palestinian state by an American administration more committed to it than any prior one, that came into office making such a state one of its highest foreign policy priorities, appointing an experienced envoy on its second day in office, devoting extraordinary diplomatic attention to the issue, based on a belief that the creation of a Palestinian state was not only the key to peace between the Palestinians and Israelis, but the key to peace throughout the entire region and a precondition to confronting Iran. The administration thought it would finish the job in about 2 years maximum. In 3 years, that administration has been unable even to get negotiations started, much less a Palestinian state created. During this whole period of time, the Palestinians have turned down a contiguous state on all of Gaza, substantially all of the West Bank, with a capital in Jerusalem, no less than 3 times. First at Camp David in July 2000, then again in January 2001 when they rejected the Clinton parameters, then again in 2008 when they rejected Prime Minister Olmert's offer, which the Bush administration privately urged the Palestinians to accept. In explaining their failures, 3 successive administrations, both Democratic and Republican, have observed how difficult it is to achieve success, saying that if it were easy, it would have been accomplished long ago. But we are now at the stage where we should probably make that observation a little more specific. If the two-state solution were a solution, it would have been a solution long ago. And after 3 offers of a state and 3 rejections, after the transfer of land comprising half the putative state, produced in response a terrorist mini-state and a new rocket war, it can fairly be argued that the two-state solution has proved to be a two-state non-solution, and that it is time for us, including those of us who might still favor a two-state solution in theory, to consider other alternatives. So I'm going to take you through a very quick and brief history of the two-state solution using a few maps covering the last 90 years of an attempt to create 2 states. And then we'll cover 4 or 5 possible alternatives to a 2-state solution. Okay, on the first slide, what we have is a map of the League of Nations mandate in 1922, which covered Jewish Palestine as going from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, and covering what was at that time the major Jewish settlements, which were, it's hard to see it on the map, but you know the places, that arranged all the way from Haifa, included Jerusalem, down to Ashkelon, Tel Aviv. All of that area was in the League of Nations mandate. That produced Arab violence, including pogroms in the latter part of the 1920s and again in the mid-30s, which then took us 15 years later to a new commission on the next slide, the Peel Commission. The Peel Commission proposed a minuscule Jewish state in the yellow portion, a much larger Arab state, and a mandated middle area, including Jerusalem, that would be an enclave that would be held by neither the Jewish state nor the Arab state. That solution was accepted by the Jews, rejected by the Arabs. 10 years later, on the next slide, we have UN Resolution 181, adopted in November of 1947, with again a truncated Jewish state in yellow and a larger Arab state in purple, I guess that is, and Jerusalem as an enclave that was not held by either of the states. It is a widely held misconception that the war in 1948 started, or the war in that period started with the Declaration of Independence by Israel, May 14th, 1948. But in fact, the war started the day after, literally the day after the UN resolution was adopted. And I'm quoting now one of the greatest historians of our day, Martin Gilbert, who said, and I quote, "From the moment of the UN vote, Arab terrorists and armed bands attacked Jewish men, women, and children all over the country, killing nearly 80 Jews in the 12 days following the vote, looting Jewish shops and attacking Jewish civilian buses on all the highways. And outside of Palestine, in virtually every major Arab city, there was violence against Jewish civilians." And that all was 5 months before Israel declared its independence, after 5 months of terrorism and violence. All right, fast forward to 2000 with the Camp David offer that was made by Israel. These maps come from Dennis Ross's book, The Missing Piece. The map on this side is what the Palestinians, to this day, allege was the Israeli offer, which they say was a series of bantustans because there were divisions between the proposed Palestinian state. But that is not correct, according to Dennis Ross. This map is what the actual Israeli offer at the end of the Camp David process was. And you can see that it was a contiguous state. It was on about 96% of the West Bank. It contemplated a 1% land swap, so altogether 97% of the West Bank. Palestinians left in September. A war started, a terror war, and that takes us to the Clinton parameters, which were proposed in December of 2000. The Clinton parameters were not a speech by President Clinton setting forth these parameters. They were the result of 3 months of secret shuttle meetings by Dennis Ross between the two sides, trying to come up with a formulation that would be, in his words, the maximum that each side could give and the minimum that each side could accept. And he came up with this. There wasn't an actual map, because although Israel formally accepted by a vote of the cabinet the Clinton parameters, the Palestinians rejected it. They rejected it in an Oval Office meeting on January 2nd, on a Saturday, with Bill Clinton and a team, including Arafat, of course, that rejected it. And you can see, obviously, that it was a contiguous state on virtually all of the West Bank, but that was rejected. Now, flash forward to Olmert's offer in September 2008. The theory by various peace processors and Palestinian people sympathetic to the Palestinian cause was that the problem back in 2000 was that Arafat could not make the transition. This was actually Dennis Ross's theory. Could not make the transition from being a guerrilla fighter to a statesman. He just couldn't bring himself to accept peace. It would go against his lifelong identity. And the other was that Clinton had rushed the process, that he had tried to win a Nobel Prize in a 2-week process at Camp David, and then with the Clinton parameters at the very end of his administration, and that what you really needed was a longer process with a different leader who would be more reasonable. And so 8 years later, you had Mahmoud Abbas and a 1-year final status negotiation process started with an international conference in Annapolis. And that ended up with, you can't quite see, the white part is the area that would be annexed by Israel. And if you go back one slide and you see what was offered 8 years before, it's basically the same. It's a little better, but it's basically the same. So it's the maximum that the Palestinians could expect from a peace process. And so you have to add, because after 8 years, a completely new process, different people involved, Republican and Democratic presidents. If the Palestinians really want a state, you would assume they know this is it. And in fact, Condoleezza Rice has said that she privately urged Abbas directly to accept the Israeli offer, and he refused. The conventional public wisdom these days is that he didn't respond. But when you don't respond, when you're asked to respond, you're given an offer, you've rejected the offer. So what is it that prevents a Palestinian state? Is it really the 2 or 3% of the West Bank? Is it really something more than the Arab neighborhoods of Jerusalem? Is it really fair compensation to refugees by the international community? What is it? And I think the way to understand the failure, the repeated failure over such a long period of time of the peace process, including the one in which Obama has engaged, is to think of it not as a peace process, but as, from the Palestinian standpoint, but as a history reversal process. If you look at the next slide, you can see that the reason that they insist on the 1967 lines, not 95% of the West Bank, they want the 1967 lines. And that is to reverse the 1967 war. If they can get that back with maybe a 1% land swap, they will have reversed the 67 war. And likewise, the right of return, if they were to get it, is intended to reverse the 1948 war. And people don't realize that when they talk about the right of return, if you look at the formal documents that are on their website that were presented to Clinton back in 2000 and still there today, by right of return they mean not just the right to go back to Israel for people who were not born in Israel, but all their descendants as well. It's not to just go back to Israel, it's to go back to their original houses. And if they don't get their original houses, then the right of return has been violated. So the right of return is really an attempt to reverse the 1948 war. And then they want all of East Jerusalem, not just the Arab areas, not just the Arab and the Christian areas, but all of East Jerusalem, which it sounds like half of the city, but actually is 100% of historic Jerusalem. So it includes all of the Jewish historic areas within that. So that if they can get that, and this is what they are insisting, then A plus B plus C equals the world before there was Israel. And that's why talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5% of the West Bank is beside the point. And compensation for refugees is beside the point. And a number of refugees that can come back to Israel is beside the point. And you don't have to take my word for it. On the next slide, I've got from a week ago. Some of you may have already seen this. It's whipping around the internet. Probably most of you have seen it. But this is a member of the Fatah Central Committee, Abbas Zaki, speaking on Al Jazeera, forget where, but Al Jazeera TV. And let's just listen to him. It's worth waiting for.
Can we full screen that?
When we say that the settlement should be based upon 6-7 borders, President Abbas understands, we understand, everybody knows that the greater goal cannot be accomplished in one go. If Israel withdraws from Jerusalem, evacuates the 650,000 settlers, and dismantles the wall, what will become of Israel? It will come to an end. Who is nervous, upset, and angry now? Netanyahu, Lieberman, and Obama, all those scumbags. Why even get into this? We should be happy to see Israel upset. If we say that what we want to wipe out Israel, come on, it's too difficult, it's not acceptable policy to say so. Don't say these things to the world, keep it to yourself. If you want the resolutions that everybody agrees upon, I say to the world, to the quartet, and to America, you promised and you turned out to be liars.
I rest my case, as they say in court. Okay, I'm going to cover quickly alternative solutions and then make just a couple final comments. Let's talk about 5 quickly. First, the one-state solution, which really is not it's a non-starter for several reasons, beginning with the fact that it's not intended as a solution, but as a means of dismantling Israel as a Jewish state. It is most often used simply to threaten Israel if it does not make the concession du jour. In any event, it's not practicable. Fatah and Hamas cannot live side by side in peace and security with themselves in a single state, much less with Israel. That takes us to the trilateral two-state solution, which is something that about 3 years ago, Reserve Major General Giora Eiland wrote a long monograph published by the Washington Institute proposing that there be a 3-step two-state solution. First, you would make Gaza double or triple its current size by adding territory from the Egyptian Sinai, which would give Gaza enough land to relieve its congestion, have more cities, give it the space it would need for an airport and a seaport. Step 2, Israel would get an equivalent amount from the West Bank, which would cover all of the major settlement blocks and defensible borders. And number 3, Israel would give Egypt the same amount from the Negev. So if you went 1, 2, 3 with about 600 square miles, you would have a trilateral two-state solution. We haven't heard about that solution since, and there's any number of problems with it, as all of you could imagine. So that takes us to the 3-state solution, which is Israel, Hamastan, and Fatah land, perhaps in federations with Egypt and Jordan. The problem with that is Egypt and Jordan, who are very big on a one-state solution as long as it is Israel that has to absorb the Palestinians, but are not anxious to absorb the Palestinians themselves if the existential threat will be to them instead of to Israel. So that's a non-starter as well. Then fourth, Jordan is Palestine, is something that the distinguished member of the Knesset, Aryeh Eldad, who's chairman of the Hatikva party, has proposed and written a long and quite interesting monograph on this solution, which would be treating or making Jordan a Palestinian state because 75% of the residents there are Palestinian. Not 75% of the citizens, but 75% of the residents. So if you gave all of the residents, the permanent residents in Jordan, the vote and citizenship, it would be a Palestinian state. You would not have to transfer any Arabs from the West Bank to Jordan. Those who reside in the West Bank could choose to be citizens of Jordan or permanent residents of Israel at their choice, and not citizens but permanent residents. It's well worth reading, the monograph. But it is a solution that he himself recognizes is for the next generation. It's not something that you can get from here to there in any reasonable time in the near future. And that takes us to the no-state solution, which we may be so wedded to the idea of a state as a solution that we've lost sight of what may be an actually better solution, which is what the Egypt-Israel Treaty in 1978 contemplated, which was a form of autonomy, not statehood, for the Palestinians, which I like to think of as a state like California. They would not have control over their borders or their airspace. They could not have a foreign policy, but like California, they could raise taxes, have terrible schools, run their own police, do things like that. That solution, it's sort of like democracy, which is the worst form of government unless you consider all the others. This may be the best solution because, although it's not a good one, it is in fact better than all the others. So, but I'm not touting it necessarily as a solution because none of these may be solutions. The solution may require two things. First is to overcome or give up at least in this area, the American religion of solutionism, which is the nearly religious belief that for every problem in the world there is a solution, that smart people like Americans can think it up or guide people to it, that if people are just reasonable and logical, they will see sooner or later what everybody knows is the solution and adopt it. It hasn't worked well the last 18 years, let me put it that way. But second, and perhaps equally important, is that we need to go back not to a solution, but to reiterating and believing in certain first principles that have been lost, in my view, in the welter of detail in maps and practical considerations. That the name of the land that Israel holds in the West Bank was originally Judea and Samaria. That it was the original land of the first and second Jewish states. That it was assigned as the area for the third one by the League of Nations. And that it is currently held rightfully and legally by Israel, based not only on history, both ancient and modern, but because it was acquired in a defensive war from those who sought, not for the first time, to destroy the modern state of Israel. And that the Palestinians have no right to a state as long as they refuse to recognize the right of the Jewish people to have a state of their own as well. If there's going to be any precondition to new negotiations, that ought to be the precondition, because unless we get that right and assert it as a matter of right, not as a matter of security or meeting people halfway, then there will be no use in discussing all of the subsidiary issues of borders, refugees, Jerusalem, water, etc. We need, having spent 18 years in this process, to go back to the first principles about a Jewish state, defend them, and reiterate them. Thank you.
And now I guess we've got Avi.
Am I unmuted yet?
Yes.
Okay. I can't see any of you, so I have to apologize. I'm going to have to guess at your reactions. What I can see is what's on the computer screen there, I would guess. And apparently there's somewhat of a delay here. So what I'm seeing on my screen is apparently a few minutes behind what you're seeing. Did I read it? Okay. So I feel a little bit like the old lectures I would have in my biology class in college, where I would have to make a note of the projector room to flip slides. So I'll ask you to flip the slides as we go through. I have no way of seeing on the screen whether you're keeping up. I'm too far behind. I see the first one's up. If I run ahead or behind, please give a shout and let me know. Just before I begin, one last thing. Thank you very much, Doris, for trying this experiment. I hope it turns out to be a success. All right. I'm sure that all of you have seen the news over the last few weeks and months that the Palestinians sought admission to the United States, to the United Nations as a member state. During the summer, Mahmoud Abbas wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in which he explained that the aim of this move was to try to pave the way for, quote, the internationalization of the conflict. It's a legal matter, not only a political one. I think what he was doing there was outlining a long-standing and a long-term Palestinian strategy to try to utilize the institutions where it has an advantage, where it has large numerical majorities, in order to carry out a campaign of legal harassment and diplomatic attacks on Israel as part of a long-term strategy of turning Israel into South Africa. That is, turning it into an illegitimate state in the eyes of the world, creating economic sanctions, and leading to domestic political pressures in Israel that would lead to the fall of the state, at least as the strategy is conceived. Now, if we can go to the next slide, you'll see that it's commonly interpreted in the media. We're looking at one of the standard interpretations here. The BBC says Palestinians want to have full membership at the UN. If Palestine were admitted as a full member in the UN, it would be able to join the UN agencies and, for example, join the International Criminal Court with it, take legal action to challenge the occupation of territory by Israel. But if you go to the next slide, you'll see that Article 4 of the Charter of the United Nations states that to become a member state, Part 2 there, the admission of any state must be effected by decision of the General Assembly upon recommendation of the Security Council. Next slide. We saw that after unpleasant election results in a congressional district that's voted Democrat for the last 100 years in New York City and suddenly voted for Republican, the Obama administration finally announced that it would be vetoing in the Security Council the Palestinian bid. That means that Palestine will not become a member state of the United Nations. So does that mean it's all over? The threat is all gone? Unfortunately, the answer is no. Go to the next slide. The threat neither began with the Palestinian attempt to join the UN, nor is it going to end if the United States casts its veto. Now, I'll just point you, for example, to the effort to join the International Criminal Court, which the BBC incorrectly stated would be an automatic result of UN membership for the Palestinians. The Palestinians actually, if you look at this letter, in 2009, 21st January 2009, the Palestinians asked the International Criminal Court to accept it as a state which recognizes the jurisdiction of the court for purposes of prosecutions of, quote, crimes committed on the territory of Palestine since 1 July 2002. Now, if we go to the next slide, you'll see that the prosecutor to the International Criminal Court, Ocampo, has stated that he's not particularly interested in whether the Palestine is a member state of the UN. He at the moment is still examining the question of whether there's a state of Palestine. He hasn't yet had acted on their previous letter asking to join the court. But if the General Assembly votes to call them an observer state, he says, that should be enough. So it doesn't make a difference whether they become members of the UN. It doesn't make a difference whether the United States casts its veto. He's ready to start prosecuting Israelis today for alleged crimes committed on the soil of, quote, Palestine. Now, the International Criminal Court is not the only institution out there. Next slide. If you look at it, I'm sure you'll all recall that the General Assembly is an institution that is not particularly friendly to Israel. In 2004, in 2003, the General Assembly voted in special session to request that the International Court of Justice issue an advisory opinion on the legality of Israel's defensive barrier in the West Bank. You'll notice that the resolution was entitled Illegal Israeli Act to occupy East Jerusalem and the rest of the occupied Palestinian territories. So to give you a nice preview of what the result was that they expected. Next slide, please. You'll notice, too, that the International Court of Justice decided for purposes of the proceedings to accept Palestine as a state and allow it to make written and oral submissions. And then, next slide, it finally issued its opinion on the 9th of July 2004, in which it basically found Israel guilty of everything except existing. And if that question had been asked, I'm sure they would have found Israel guilty on that score too. Next slide. Now, there's really no end to the kinds of preposterous legal allegations that can be made against Israel. If we're on the right slide now, we're looking at one that's entitled Israel's Crimes Against Palestinians, War Crimes, Crimes Against Humanity, Genocide. Francis Boyle, the author of this particular missive, is someone who served as legal advisor to the Palestinian delegation in the Middle East peace negotiations, which should tell you something right there about the peace process. And it goes through various things in order to demonstrate what it considers to be Israeli crimes of genocide. If you want to know just how far things can go to the next slide. You'll see the Organization of the Islamic Conference accused Israel of engaging in violations of international law by, quote, constructing a synagogue on near the Al-Aqsa Mosque. That means somewhere in the Old City. So you didn't know this probably, but it's true according to more than 1/4 of the states that are members of the United Nations. The Organization of the Islamic Conference, as it was called then, constitutes 54 states, I believe, within the United Nations of less than 200. That means a little more than a quarter. A little more than a quarter of the states believe that it is against international law Israel to permit the construction of synagogues in the Old City of Jerusalem. Now, you might say that's just a political organization. Surely this is not the sort of thing that will get a welcome hearing elsewhere in the world. But if you go to the next slide, I'll remind you of the infamous Goldstone report. That was a United Nations fact-finding mission on the conflict in Gaza following 8,000 Hamas rocket attacks on Israel. It was led by a former Chief Justice of the South African Supreme Court. And it managed to go through, we'll skip ahead 2 slides. You can see that the Goldstone report found that international law forbids arresting members of Hamas. It requires giving Hamas affiliates public appointments and requires giving Hamas financial support. Now, surely that can't be the law, but yet you have a respected jurist saying that's exactly what it was. You go to the next slide, you'll see photographs of various Hamas fighters that were deployed during the war by Hamas. Some of them were in paramilitary police uniforms. They wore these paramilitary police uniforms because they were incorporated in official security organizations of Gaza in order to get publicly funded by the West. Next slide. According to the Goldstone report, these paramilitary troops of Hamas were civilians that could not be touched. It was a war crime for Israel to attack them. Next slide. Now, of course, Goldstone ultimately recanted one of the accusations that he made in this report, that he admitted that Israel did not target civilians as a matter of policy. But next slide, the other three members of the Goldstone Commission didn't agree. They stand by their statement that subsequent development did not render any part of the mission's report unsubstantiated, erroneous, or inaccurate. The mission's report, as it stands, is completely accurate according to the other three, and it is still an official UN document, and it is still used around the world to attack Israelis. So, next slide. South African groups sought to have Tzipi Livni, now Israel's opposition leader, arrested. Next slide. The very week after Goldstone retracted his accusation, a Palestinian group sought Shimon Peres's, the Shimon Peres, the president of Israel, is arrested in Switzerland. And so these documents can go off on very, very strange anti-Israel theories, and then continue to be used against Israel for the future. Now, I said that this is not an artifact purely of the movement to get into the United Nations, and it really goes back quite a way. So if we go to the next slide, I'll remind you of the attempt in about approximately a decade ago to get Ariel Sharon tried in Belgium for a massacre committed by Lebanese Christian militia, the Phalange, against Palestinians in two neighborhoods of Beirut, southern Shatila. You'll go to the next slide, you'll see yet another attempt. Several years ago, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, an Orwellian name if I've ever heard one, filing a lawsuit in Spain against a number of Israeli military officials for an airstrike against a senior Hamas terrorist. Now, there's a variety, what you can see here, there's a variety of different ways in which the Palestinians can and have pursued a legal agenda against Israel using any institution that they can and that is likely to be friendly. That includes not only the International Criminal Court, which we still don't know how it's going to react to the Palestinian claims, although it now appears it's going to accept jurisdiction. It's also the UN General Assembly, which will vote out anything anti-Israel that the Palestinians request. It includes the International Justice, which is asked to by the General Assembly, will issue anti-Israel opinions. It includes fact-finding commissions that may be appointed by the General Assembly and by the Human Rights Council. And it includes foreign courts in Switzerland, in South Africa, in England, in Spain. So what can we do about this? This is a serious problem. It goes back a long way, in a long time. And it seems that it's something that's not going to be going away. So what can we do about it? We can go to the next slide. There is one suggestion in a there. Let's say this is the dominant suggestion that you'll see in the Haaretz newspaper and among Israel's mainstream movement, as well as its far left, that what Israel needs to do is to launch a, quote, preemptive diplomatic strike. That is, Israel had better run and try at any price to revive negotiations with the Palestinians, because that's the only way that this lawfare campaign is going to be defeated. Now, I don't go into too great detail, but I think it's fairly evident that if you look at the dates at which these cases have been filed, that filed during periods when there were negotiations, during periods when there were no negotiations. It's very difficult to believe that revived negotiations will get rid of this threat. What creates the threat is something else. If you'll go to the next slide, it's basic numbers. The Palestinians go to the institutions where they think they can win. They always win in the United Nations. Next slide. They always win the Human Rights Council. I mentioned the communist, so I'll just talk to you verbally. The reason the International Criminal Court is so attractive is because it permits the filing of suits against states that are not members, as long as the alleged crimes occurred on the soil of a member state. And so Palestinians claim jurisdiction over the West Bank. They claim the West Bank is Palestinian soil, and then bring charges against Israel, even though Israel is not a member of the ICC. Nonetheless, Israel has had some victories, and so this maybe points the way to what Israel can do. We can go to the next slide. Can I just check, are we on the UK alters law targeting war crime suspects now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, just in the last few weeks, the UK finally approved a change to its law forbidding universal jurisdiction claims against foreigners unless the Attorney General approves. Next slide. Spain passed a law like this approximately 2 years ago, doing the same thing, forbidding private filing of lawsuits in Spanish courts. Next slide. Belgium did the same thing. Now, if you think about what it is that is in common among all these changes, what happened was pressure was brought to bear, political pressure was brought to bear at the weak point of these institutions. What is the weak point of the institutions? Well, in Belgium, what it was that someone held suit against Bush and against George Herbert Walker Bush, not George W. Bush. Donald Rumsfeld remembered that there's no particular need for NATO headquarters to be in Belgium if Americans can be sued there, which led the Belgians to think about the strategy of perhaps changing the law. In Spain, what happened was somebody filed suit against China for alleged crimes in Tibet, and suddenly the Spanish thought that perhaps it might be a good idea to revisit the universal jurisdiction statute. Now, the story in the UK is a little bit more complex. It is the same sort of story where it was spread to the Brits that perhaps there might be some political embarrassment waiting for them if they continue to permit their institutions to be used this way. Now, what's the way that Israel can bring political pressure to bear on UN institutions or the International Criminal Court, where they're not particularly interested in diplomacy? Well, I would say, if you'll skip to the next slide, that the way to do this is to start preparing suits against the Palestinians. For whatever reason, Israel has neglected to do this on its own, and the very, very large and very organized pro-Israel community around the world has failed to do this as well. I can think of only one organization off the top of my head that that works at prosecuting Palestinians for war crimes and crimes against humanity. That is an organization in Israel called Geostrategy. I can't think of why it is that they're alone in this, or why others don't do it. The war crimes committed by Hamas and by other organizations, by Fatah, by the Islamic Jihad, are blatant and easy to prove. I don't know that the ICC would in fact prosecute them, but would certainly make it more uncomfortable for the ICC to prosecute Israelis, while many petitions were filed demanding that the ICC prosecute Palestinian war crimes. If you'll skip ahead quickly to the next 3 slides, what you can see is pictures of various of the suicide bombings that took place in 2002 and 2003 and 2001. And go to the next slide. The Hamas tried to hijack ambulances during the Gaza war. The crimes committed by Hamas are not limited simply to carrying out acts of terrorism. They also include various other war crimes, such as misusing protected symbols. Next slide. Hamas militants fought in civilian posts. Next slide. Hamas improperly stationed military personnel fight. No. In hospitals, in fact, Shifa Hospital in Gaza served as quarters for Hamas fighting the Gaza war. Next slide. There are even more heinous crimes which they have committed, or at least which are worth attempting to prosecute. I'll just leave you with one last. We should be on the last slide now. I'll just leave you with one tantalizing example. The Palestinian Authority has affirmed the death penalty for land sales to Israelis. It says here in the title, it's also to Jews if you read the fine print. In fact, it's primarily land sales to Jews. I'm not aware of any case in which the Palestinian Authority has prosecuted a Palestinian for selling land to an Arab citizen of Israel. Palestinian Authority, again, it imposes the penalty on persons who sold land to Jews. That is, I think, quite clearly a crime of apartheid, which is one of the crimes that the ICC can prosecute. Now, again, what will be the fate of all these prosecutions? I don't really know. I doubt the ICC will give a fair hearing. But if one wants to put pressure on these institutions, then I'm sorry to say that the best way to do this is by embarrassment, by making it embarrassing for them to continue prosecuting an anti-Israel agenda. And the sooner that Israel starts thinking about the threat seriously and preparing the way for filing countersuits, the sooner it will be able to block the threat. Thank you very much.
So we'll collect note cards, bring them up here, cycle through them. This was a question to me, but I want to actually get the panel's input. The first question is the easy question from the first talk, and also it kind of bled into Jennifer's talk, which is, has Obama really changed? Is the UN speech indicative of a change in his calculations? The UN speech being robustly pro-Israel, if we accept that interpretation. Is that a genuine shift in Obama's thinking that would therefore herald a change in U.S. policy, or is it an electoral consideration, the impact to that being that after 2012 all bets are off? I get Rick, then Jen, then Avi, if you want to clock in at the end.
Sure.
Well, I don't know, but I would say that perhaps an answer to it is provided by a post that Jeffrey Goldberg wrote about the speech based on what he said was actual reporting, so not just his opinion. And he said that the speech emanated from two things. One, which I sort of discount, is the Obama administration's disgust with hypocrisy at the UN. And the other was actual anger at Abbas for embarrassing the United States and its president at the UN, which which sounds a little more like the president we learned to know. So I did a post which I called, it was a speech du jour, and it is good for this du jour only. It reflected the current situation, which was the U.S. interest was in stopping a procedure that would effectively eliminate the peace process and U.S. jurisdiction over it, and embarrass the United States and its president. And that's the kind of speech that the Palestinians will get if they do that kind of thing. It doesn't matter it doesn't mean that that is the kind of speech they will always get in the future.
Thanks.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with Rick on his interpretation of why the speech was given the way it was. Certainly the language was pro-Israel. There was probably something of a perfunctory cast to that. But one of the things we have to keep in mind, in my view, is that, again, the peace process is looking in the rearview mirror, wanting to drive a boss back to the peace process is a rearguard action. It's definitely playing defense. It's not looking to the future. So whatever it may mean about the Obama administration, I don't think it means that they're going to be coming up with good ideas for how we move forward.
Avi, what do you, any...
Yeah,
go ahead.
Very briefly, I wish I could agree with you, Rick, but I don't.
Story of my life.
I find it very difficult to believe that there's been human change here. When Omri spoke about zombie ideas, I think that you find zombie ideas. You look at the New York Times version of the Arab-Israeli peace process, and the zombie ideas get printed every day. I think that that is a solid reflection of what's in the head of a sizable wing of the Democratic Party. And unfortunately also the head of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Avi's basically right on that count. The question is, listen, there are a lot of pro-Israel Democrats in Washington, D.C. Many of them are in office. Their base is much less pro-Democrat. But, listen, I mean, when we did this panel, when Jennifer, Rick, and I were on a panel at CJHS months ago, one of the things that I committed to is I said that I think that what you're going to see is President Obama attacking Israel, a rift between the United States and Israel, and Democratic Jews siding with Obama and looking to scapegoat Israel. You haven't seen that. You've seen much the opposite. Now, it could be that that doesn't have electoral considerations, but we should distinguish between the left's foreign policy big minds, the Obama people in D.C., the old diplomacy hands, and those have different interests, but I do think that probably the skepticism about Obama being mugged by reality is probably, unfortunately, as Avi said, more right than wrong. Let me shift to a series of questions, and this will go again in the same order, about what Israel is going to do in the next, let's say, 6 months. And the way that these questions have been coming in is, do you think, Jennifer, for instance, that Israel will forge alliances with great powers and rising powers like China and Russia? Do you think that Israel will go on the offensive the way that Avi talked about? Do you think that Israel will put out a non-state solution the way Rick talked about? Or do you think the Israelis are going to roll with it and are going to keep doing the same things that the panelists today have criticized them for? So we'll start with Rick, then Jen, then Avi.
Well, I guess my reaction would be that nothing is probably going to happen at all until it's clear who the next president is going to be, or rather the president for the next 4 years. It will make a difference to the actions of all parties in the region and the dispute as to whether this is the last year of the Obama administration and the first year of a much more friendly one, or another 4 years of Obama freed from the sort of electoral considerations that might have accounted for the UN speech. So I would expect people to tread water.
during the next year. The debt ceiling discussion, remember Obama wanted to put it off for a year, did not want it coming up before the election. It's sort of the same thing with the peace process. There's this one-year process, even if the Palestinians agreed to it, would take us, by the time it got implemented and actually done, to a time next year when it would be much clearer as to who is going to be president for 4 years after that, and that would be when I think you'd see some movement. But until then, I don't expect anything.
I think that's a very good point. One thing I would say, though, is that we've reached the point where the next, who the next American president is going to be is not necessarily Israel's biggest calculation. I think we really have no idea what's going to happen in the world, and particularly in the Middle East, between now and November 2012. And Israel's going to have a lot of maneuvering to do to deal with whatever it is. Turkey, in my view, is in some ways a bigger concern, I won't say a threat, but a concern than Iran is, because Turkey has the cover of appearing to many Western eyes as a sort of domesticated Islamic state. They look like a safe way to coexist with Islam, and there are Islamism, I should say, and there are real issues with that. Turkey's a member of NATO. Turkey is trying to get away with a lot of stuff because she's a member of NATO and because she sits between East and West and regards herself as a broker between the non-Islamic world and the Islamic world. So Israel's going to have that to deal with, and I think that just what's coming up from other countries is really going to drive her as much as anything else.
Avi, do you think that that Israeli leaders are going to push back, or are they going to keep rolling with delegitimization?
Well, let me answer the specific questions you asked at the outset. Will Israel work towards forging alliances? Well, I'm not a great fan of Israel's current foreign minister, but I have to admit that that's one issue where he's done quite well from day one, attempting to forge new alliances outside of Israel's traditional circles. And I think that Israel is going to continue doing that. Will Israel go on the offensive diplomatically, the way I suggest? After speaking to various people in the foreign ministry bureaucracy, I can guarantee you it's not going to happen, unfortunately. Will Israel adopt a rig solution? I'm fairly confident that it won't either, unfortunately. But I can tell you that currently, the reason that the Israeli government won't do it is that the Israeli government, or at least the politicians comprising the major parties in the government, don't think that the Israeli public is ready for it. At the same time, if you look at the polls, what the polls show is something quite contradictory. The majority of these favor the creation of a Palestinian state in order to reach peace. The majority of Israelis also think that peace with the Palestinians is not possible. This is not sustainable in the long run. That is, you cannot have the public holding these contradictory opinions in the long run. Some leader is going to break through that log jam by forcing the public to face that contradiction and lead it one way or the other.
Okay, so these next two questions, one's very, very easy and traditional, and one's very, very nuanced and open-ended, and we get both, as far as I see, on every CJHS panel that Doris puts on. The first one, we'll start with the easy one, which is a perennial favorite, which is where can most folks get pro-Israel information? And the more nuanced version of that is, what institutions do the panelists, A, go to for their information, and B, think are doing good work in the media war and the propaganda war, and that should be on people's radar? Rick?
I don't know, you read J-Post, you should read Haaretz, even though you probably won't agree with most of its coverage.
Left wing.
You should read it because you should know what's said. It wasn't endorsing. Wynette, and the others are escaping me at the present. You should get, if you are not on it, each day the Israeli Foreign Ministry sends out a
email with a summary of the lead editorials in 5 or 6 of Israeli newspapers, including ones that are in Hebrew only, that most of us could not read directly, but they have English summaries. That's a useful email to get every day.
Yeah, in addition to what Rick mentioned, and the extension of this is escaping the JINSA, J-I-N-S-A. If you're familiar with them, tremendous source of information about Israel's strategic priorities, basically a whole lot of stuff that you might want to know about national security. Very, very, very good source. I can highly recommend it. Something that you may not think about that I have found very useful is some of the moderate that's something that we here in the U.S. do not get in any way, shape, or form from our mainstream media. We never hear that stuff. So something like that is a good thing to look into.
I'll say the job is media, foundation for the defense of democracies.
Yeah.
Memory,
All the big, I mean, we should name check the big ones. NGO Monitor, Memory, Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Arsheva is more of a news, less of a media outlet.
Understand one more here?
Yeah, definitely.
Just add camera.
And camera. Camera, the honest reporting.
Palestine Media Watch.
Safe Watch.
Fantastic.
Carolyn Glick. You like Carolyn Glick?
Carolyn Glick at JPost, sure. The way to enter this ecosystem, if you're interested, is start following bloggers who post regularly. And within a week, 2, after you check out their blog row on the site, they'll have their favorite sites. You'll see after a month, 2 months who they cite. And, you know, those are the people producing good news. Next question is the open-ended one, but one that comes up, and it's difficult to answer, but there's a version of it that's more pointed. And the general question is, what is going on in the foreign policy community in the United States that they are getting so many things wrong so often and not adjusting? Is it ideological? Is it institutional? Is it sociological? Is it that they don't want to be embarrassed at Davos when they head out as State Department reps, and so they just wish Israel would go away? That always elicits open-ended questions. I'll make it more pointed based on one of your questions, which is what is the panelists' opinion in general on that community, but also specifically on the controversy with Walt and Mearsheimer over the last couple of days. As you know, over the last couple of weeks, as you know, Mearsheimer and Walt published a book called The Israel Lobby a couple years ago that asserted that U.S. interests were being subverted by a loose coalition of pro-Israel Jews and non-Jews. They were accused of being anti-Semitic because accusations of small Kabbalistic Jews who corrupt non-Jews to undermine countries is an anti-Semitic trope. And Mearsheimer recently came out with a blurb on the book, a positive blurb on the book, of an out-and-out self-hating anti-Semite. So are they indicative of the foreign policy community, or is something else going on in the halls of our usual think tanks than what's going on there? Maybe we'll go on.
Defer to Jennifer on that.
Jen, foreign policy community?
Oh, you're deferring to me. Okay, well, yeah, the foreign policy community in general, how shall I say this? Because I want to be polite and fair to them, because there are a lot of good people in the foreign policy community. In general, they have a rarefied way of thinking, and one of the things that I've seen over about the last 10 years is that we've had such a long time with all the same assumptions that they don't touch base with their assumptions anymore and verify them against reality. And that's something I have really seen in the peace process and everything that's happened since Israel left Gaza.
Mike.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mike, yeah. Basically, it's been a very long time since they have had to think hard about what their assumptions are and what the U.S. should be doing in the world, and so forth. And I think there's a lot of confusion. There are old hands who could have seen ways for us to do a lot of things better over the last few years. And there was even some of that in the Bush administration. You know, it's not all Obama, but Obama is kind of on steroids in a lot of these things. And there's a lot of confusion. There's definitely, from what I hear, a morale problem with the old hands, and there is an ideology issue. For example, the responsibility to protect principle that was invoked in the UN for why we should do a non-hostile kinetic military action in Libya. That was pure ideology. There was nothing realistic. There was no realistic statesmanship in that. It was all ideology. So it's kind of a collision of those different factors. That's my opinion.
Avi, do you get a sense that there's movement on the Israeli side of the foreign policy community? I know you mentioned that a lot of them are stuck in a rut ideologically, but are there ironically, young Turks coming up through the system? Is there any chance that they're being mugged by reality?
I think you have to distinguish between the political echelon and the bureaucracy. I think bureaucracies everywhere in Israel and in the United States are very, very resistant to change. You move up the chain by basically agreeing with your superiors. And in Israel, the foreign ministry bureaucracy is even worse than the State Department bureaucracy. It's a unionized system in which it's very, very, very important that someone move through all the right hoops and say yes to all the right people. So I don't see any creative or interesting ideas coming out of the foreign ministry bureaucracy the near future. It's occasionally some do, but for the most part, what we're talking about is something that a dysfunctional culture that is not going to change. On the other hand, the political system in Israel is very, very dynamic. And things can change in an amazing speed where there's no prior sign whatsoever that it's going to happen. If you think about what happened to the Gaza withdrawal, which I think was a terrible foreign policy mistake, it basically bubbled out of nowhere into implementation within less than 2 years. And then it was discredited less than 2 years later. I think that ideas can move very, very quickly through the Israeli political system. And so, notwithstanding that the foreign ministry bureaucracy is not going to be the source of these ideas, probably, I actually think there is a great deal of dynamism possible.
The next question, and this is a collection of several questions, is given that it seems that we're in for a period of long-term U.S. decline, either by choice or not, or necessity, which is to say either ideologically we elect leaders who view their historical role as one of quote-unquote managing America's decline, or because we have to cut back out of economic necessity, given that a number of people asked about the new alliances that different countries in the Middle East, including Israel, will be jostling to create. And that's a thread that's also run through a bunch of the talks. Jen's talk explicitly, but also Avi's talk about how it was Russia, China, and the United States that embarrassed other countries into changing universal jurisdiction laws. So I'd like to make this question both general and pointed to all three of the panelists, which is can Israel forge new alliances, and will those alliances be useful? So for instance, in Rick's case, I'd like to hear whether you think that China and Russia are winnable on the issue of statehood. In Jen's case, to what extent can military alliances be forged? And in Avi's case, do you think that that there's still a degree to which we'll find Russia and China amenable to undermining universal jurisdiction laws globally?
Well, I'm not sure Russia and China are winnable on statehood because, for one thing, they've already come out publicly to vote for Palestinian statehood at the UN. So I think they're more or less a lost cause. But I think the United States has done actually a decent job of rounding up votes in the Security Council against the Palestinian petition. By all accounts, they appear to be only one or two, the U.S. appears to be only one or two votes away from blocking the 9 votes the Palestinians would need. And and the key may be Bosnia. Bosnia is going off of the UN. It's a temporary member. It goes off at the end of 2011. How hard is it to go to Bosnia if you're the last remaining superpower in the world and say we're not going to be on very good relations after this year if you don't at least abstain? Well, of course, if you do abstain, here are certain things that we would look upon favorably. So I still think the United States has the power in situations like that to use its power. It may be diminished, it may be changing, it may be more difficult, but it's more a question of being willing to use it than whatever it is, than anything else.
Now, one of the things about the question is, again, that it's rearward looking. The question about a Palestinian state looks one way if there's a superpower and it's the United States, and it looks a different way if there's not. One of the, Russia and China, for example, sure, in 1989 they said, yes, they recognize a Palestinian state. However, there's a lot of freak that goes with that in terms of the Arab world and Islamism and who is for whom and who is allied with whom and so forth. All of that, to all of that, the issue of a Palestinian state matters. And Russia and China have counted on the U.S. For the last 22 years or whatever it is to prevent the Palestinian state issue from breaking out of security boundaries. Now, if we're not there to do that, then they may not go back on what they said in 1989, but they're going to have a different view on it. And what everyone wants, Turkey wants this, Iran wants this, the Muslim Brotherhood wants it, Saudi Arabia wants it. What everyone wants is control of how there becomes a Palestinian state. They don't want it to happen under someone else's control. And for Russia and China both, but principally for Russia, that is an issue of jockeying and whom do you ally with, and can you get the one who's going to control the Palestinian state on your side? Again, because Russia lives in that neighborhood. She's got a lot of Islamist insurgents. She has to worry about what Turkey's going to do, what everyone else is going to do. So that's how Russia sees this. And frankly, they're just glad that we have been tamping this problem down for the last 2 decades. If we're not going to do that anymore, then they're going to see things differently, and they'll see Israel differently. And in terms of military alliances, whoever needs Israel will make a military alliance with them like that. And that's going to change and shift. It's, like traffic on the 405. It looks one way 1 second, and the next second it looks completely different. That's how it's going to be for Israel in the coming years, I think.
Avi, Russia, China on universal jurisdiction?
I'm not sure I accept the premise of your question. That is, first of all, I don't agree that the United States is in long-term decline. I think that the current policies of the United States, if followed in the long term, will lead to a long-term decline. But I very much doubt that these policies will be enforced past the next elections. Now, on the question of whether Israel can forge new alliances, I think that Israel already is doing so. The problem is that we don't see it, and we don't see it because we think of alliances in terms of the Israeli-U.S. relationship, which is one that is really, really rare in international affairs and will not be duplicated with Israel's relationship anywhere else in the world. But the truth is that Israel has been able to build working alliances on all sorts of issues with all sorts of countries that you wouldn't expect. I'll just give you a brief example. Israel has built a fairly successful alliance to try to contain the growing threat from Turkey, which includes an alliance with Greece, with Cyprus, and on some issues with Russia. This is, I think, the way you have to think about building these alliances, item by item. Now, opposite that Israel does terribly in forging alliances against the Palestinians, I think it has to do more with what Israel's policy is rather than what its attempt to forge alliances. That is, Israel's policy is basically defensive and aimed both in action and in rhetoric at convincing people that the Palestinians are basically right, but we have to worry about the details. And I think as long as Israel is pitching that line, it's really hard for it to take decisive measures diplomatically to try to shore up new alliances. That's, I think, where Israel is failing. And I don't think it's an issue of forging alliances. I think it's more an issue of thinking about how to rearrange its agenda so that Israel can use the alliances it's already building.
Okay. We're approaching 9:30, so I'm going to cut it off after this question. Videotapes on. People are on the spot. Predict the next Middle East war. Rick?
Well, I guess what I don't know about a prediction, but I would worry about a three-front war. Wherever it starts, it's likely to drag in other players at the same time. So if there is a war, I think it will not come just from Gaza or just from Lebanon or just from Syria or wherever. It will all at once.
Jennifer?
Yeah, actually, I think something else may preempt a Middle East war. But I agree with Avi, and I know I've been pretty negative about the prospects of the U.S. tonight, but we have everything we had 3 years ago. We just have a different president. And we can't go back to the way things were 3 years ago, but we have everything we need to establish a new form of stability and to get back to using our power in a good and useful way. And unless something breaks between now and the next president, it will be very possible to avert a Middle Eastern war. Just one more comment about a Middle Eastern war. Nobody wants one until he's sure that he's going to win. And believe me, they learned from '67. And it's different players now. Turkey is a player. Turkey is definitely a potential player. And Iran is a player. And they're all going to jockey around and mainly try to prevent the other guy from being in a position of advantage. That's what they're going to be trying to do in the next few years. So I don't think they're going to be ready to go to war. They're going to be jockeying for advantage.
Avi?
I'm not going to engage in any predictions. I think the saying is that after the Second Temple, prophecy is the realm of fools. So I'm going to try not to be a fool. I'll just say that it seems to me the best way to ensure that Israel is not in a war in the near future is to be prepared for one. And the war that Israel has to prepare for include any variety of Iran, Turkey, Syria, Hezbollah, Lebanon, Egypt, and even, of course, the Palestinians, and even possibly a change in Jordan. And these are all threats that have to be taken into account. They could all come in some strange combination that we can't predict right now. So I think that Israel has to be ready for a threat package the like of which it's not been preparing for in the recent past. But I don't think that necessarily means that any of these is going to break out into war.
On that note, thank you all for coming here, and good night.